This is Shelley Blanton-Stroud at Mystery Review Crew with a story behind the story with Anastasia Zadeik. Welcome, Anastasia.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Oh, I'm thrilled to have you here. Anastasia is a writer, an editor, and an oral storyteller. After graduating summa cum laude from Smith College with a degree in psychology, she had an international career in neuropsychological research while raising her children. She now serves as director of operations for the San Diego Writers Festival and as a board member for the literary nonprofit So Say We All. Her debut novel, Blurred Fates, here it is, Blurred Fates, published 2 days before we recorded this conversation, and her launch party took place just last night. So you can see that it took me a lot of chutzpah to ask her to get on the line today to talk to us. So let me ask you first. Well, first, let me say congratulations. What an achievement. So recent.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah. And ask, how did it feel to celebrate your debut novel at your local bookstore last night?
It was fantastic. Honestly, the writing community and my friends and family came out to support me. And I really had a good time. I was a little bit nervous before I went out, but my interviewer was my writing coach and friend of many, many years. And so it's funny, before I left, my son said to me, just remember, you're just having a conversation with Marnie. And that totally relaxed me. And it was true. It was like having a nice long talk with a friend.
Yeah.
It's just a big audience out there.
Yeah. A little private, meaningful conversation with hordes of people listening in.
Yes.
Well, I don't know if people can fully understand how the effect of this celebration of a launch party in the life of a writer, because so much of what you do is done in private, and there's usually such a long period of gestation and so many steps in the process before this book is birthed into the world.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about your writing and your publication process? Was this something that came to you quickly and you jotted it off, or was it gestated for a very long time?
So I actually wrote the first draft of this book, the book that became Blurred Fates. I wrote it 10 years ago. And at the time, my mother had been diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. My stepdaughter came to live with us, and she didn't want to be with us. And about a year after she came to live with us, her mom died of a heroin overdose. And so there was a lot going on in my life, a lot of things going on behind the scenes. And I lived in a neighborhood that was very, very, everything was really perfect on the outside. And I didn't write this during that time period, but where the idea came for the book was that I felt like this was back in the early 2000s. People didn't really talk about stuff like the mental health issues, trauma. It was even Alzheimer's disease. People didn't really talk about that. And my mom was quite young. She was just in her early 60s. And so people kind of didn't understand what was going on with her. So there's a lot of things that I felt like my outside life and my inside life they were not the same thing. And so that's where the germ of the idea came from, was about a woman whose interior life is so different from her exterior life, but that some of the things that she's holding on to are things that she hasn't even allowed herself to think about. So there's secrets that she's kept from her spouse and from everyone that she knows, but there's also secrets she's keeping from herself, just from a psychological protective mechanism. And so I wrote the first draft in 9 months, and then I gave it to some beta readers, and I got some feedback. And then I went to a writers' conference, and I heard from the keynote a really important piece of information, which was that you should end each chapter with something unresolved to make sure that your reader turns the page between chapter to chapter. And I went back in the second revision of the novel, I realized that every one of my chapters was like its own little short story. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. Mm-hmm. And the endings were often quite it was like tying something up with a little bow. So there was no incentive for the reader to keep going. Like, it was like, oh, okay, good. So in the second rewrite, I changed the structure of the novel. And in so doing, I did not realize at the time, and did not realize until very recently, that I had created a thriller. It was not intended to be written that way. But when I started trying to tie the threads together and trying to make unresolved issues go from chapter to chapter, and then weave back in some of the issues that I had unresolved early, sprinkling little answers throughout the book that led to the revelations that come at the end of the book, that I wasn't doing it intentionally at all, but that's what ended up happening, is that turned it into a thriller. And it actually lived after the first probably 4 years. I worked on it for about 4 years, back and forth with some things. I ended up putting it in a drawer, and it lived there for 3 years. And I really didn't do much to it at all. Then pulled it out again to go to another writers' conference. And at that writers' conference, I brought a portion of it and received some really great feedback from other writers that were there. And they encouraged me to pull it back out. And so I did. And then it went to a developmental editor that was a former Big Five editor. And she wrote me back with 7 single-space pages of notes. And I made all those changes. Then I gave it to another round of beta readers, made those changes, and then did the copy editing and then the proofreading. And so the process took, once I pulled it out of the drawer, I've been working on it, not every day, but certainly fairly consistently, and at least and particularly, as you know, from doing 2 books, that it's a lot of, it takes a lot of time, even when you've got it finished.
I love that, finished. You're right. I have a friend whose first novel was really well accepted and rewarded, and people kept writing about her as an overnight success. And she was like, 10 years silently struggling and then an overnight success.
Exactly.
The average first novel does take 10 years. And I think it can't help but be connected to that Malcolm Gladwell old saw about you need 10 years of practice before you know how to do something.
That is absolutely true. And I think that, the older I got, the more I realized that most things in life are a practice. You practice yoga, you practice law, you practice medicine.
Right.
I don't like to think that much about the idea that the surgeon is still practicing, but but it is like everything's a practice. We continue to get better at things and to learn things. And I've learned a lot in the publishing process alone. I've learned more than I realized I didn't know.
That's right.
So,
well, I was just, when you said that about practices, different professional practices, and of course you're a professional author, but also, you've had this career as an international, as working in neuropsychological research. And of course, that's already on its very face, it's fascinating. But I only just got your book yesterday, and I think it's fantastic. We will finish our conversation and I'll keep reading. But right away, it is clear to me that your curiosity about and skill at revealing how a person's psychological situation might affect their decision making. And so there's a couple of things that a reader could pick up on right away that are of interest. And, one of them is related to the role of memory in your novel. And another is this idea of maybe PTSD and triggering things. And so could you tell us first a little bit about your background in neuropsychology and to what degree it played a role in how you saw your character, Kate?
Yeah, so when I worked in neuropsych, I worked for a company that was conducting clinical research in the field of memory. And so we were primarily studying 2 things. One was memory disorders like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, frontotemporal dementia. And we ran clinical drug trials for companies that were looking at compounds to see if they were helpful in not curing, but forestalling and making it possible for people with those memory disorders to live productive lives longer. But we were also looking at what is considered quote unquote normal memory loss and tracking that over time and across different parameters of memory. And of course, that involved then just becoming more well-versed in memory itself, how memories are formed, how they're lost, how they're one of the most fascinating things to me is how a memory can be misremembered, stored in that misremembered form, and remembered as truth because you've rehearsed that memory over and over, and every time you talk about it or think about it, you reinforce that pathway in your brain that then convinces you that that's what really happened. And that to me was always fascinating, was when I would go to my brothers and sisters. I have 4 brothers and sisters, and we would talk about something that happened in our family, and we would all remember it completely differently.
Yeah.
I mean, the kernel of the story was the same, but based on our birth order, based on how old we were when it happened, based on what was going on in our life at the time, we saw the world differently. And I think that can be true in all relationships. But so for me, the idea of an inciting incident being something that at one and the same time is not remembered by one person, and it triggers memories for the other person that she has kept buried for decades, and yet they're both moving forward with trying to figure out what to do with their relationship in a way that they're both operating off of kind of not only different information, but differently faulted information, if that makes sense.
I love that. It makes me think when my first novel, Copy Boy, came out, the beginning of it was based on stories told to me by my father for my whole life. And I just manipulated it the way I wanted to, changing things radically. And when he read the book, he said, "That's not what happened, but it's the truth." And I appreciated that because the facts of the details were inaccurate. I didn't get it the way he remembered it. However, I did get at the truth of how he felt about it. And sometimes that's true with memory and sometimes not, that 2 different people, like you said, can even experience the same thing, but experience it completely differently. So it's probably very familiar to a lot of your readers. When they start to see this play out in your novel, they're going to connect, maybe not with the details of the situation,
right,
but for the experience of this kind of trouble with memory.
Absolutely. And I think that's, I think one of the things about, like, and I always tell people this book is not in any way autobiographical, but it's informed by my own life experiences. And I think that what I hope is that when and I'm finding that to be true, readers are writing to me and saying, this happened to me. It's not what happened to Kate, but it's something that triggered for them. And it gives them almost permission to talk about these topics that, even though they are talked about far more than they were in the past, they're still somewhat cloaked in secrecy and a little bit of stigma. And so I think that when you give people the opportunity to reflect on them through a character, it's freeing. It's not about them, really.
I love that. It makes me also think about, reading even just the beginning of your book so far, reading about how Kate reacts to things that are happening in the very beginning. It's clear to me it's not the same way I would react, but it reminds me very much of a good friend who explained about her early life experiences and how she was traumatized in those experiences. And she just constantly carries that trauma with her, that maybe underneath this layer of learned behavior, interacting with others. But when a certain thing happens, boom, that door opens and she's in that moment again. And she seems to react. To me, it's shocking to see how she'll react at something that doesn't seem like that big a deal.
Exactly.
But to her, it brings her right back to that moment that was a big deal. And
And I
was
think
this a conscious decision for you in creating your protagonist?
Well, and yeah, because in particular, I think it's interesting when you think about how our brains are formed, and the idea that all this research has come out recently about the fact that your frontal lobe is still forming up into your 20s, and decision making is still faulty for young people. And a lot of times the decisions they make that older adults will be like, how could you? It's because they haven't gotten there yet. But imagine a child who has gone through trauma and has viscerally experienced these memories, and these memories are stored in their brain, but they don't have the right system for organizing it or understanding it or rationalizing it. So it's just experienced in that childhood way still as an adult. When you have that happen to you, that early reaction is still the 11-year-old that's experiencing it, or the 8-year-old that's experiencing it. And if it's been something that you haven't been given permission by society or by your family, so many families, we all have skeletons in the closet, and there's things, you just don't talk about that. And so imagine that that's the world in which you've lived in, and those memories are supposed to not be talked about, that when you experiencing it now, you're not only experiencing it with that childhood kind of understanding, but you're experiencing all of that shame of the idea that this thing that happened to you is something that you're not supposed to talk about. You're not so I think that those kinds of things become very powerful. And I have friends too that, things will happen in their life and I'll be like, wow, that reaction was not what I expected. And I've had people tell me that they do not agree with the way Kate processes things. And for me, that was why it was critical to write it in first person, because I wanted the reader to see the world from Kate's view. Mm-hmm. It may not be correct. It may not be the way that someone with a more stable upbringing would view it, but it's her view. And so I'm hoping to, like I said, you give people permission to find some empathy for somebody in their own life that they just don't understand. Maybe we're all dealing with something.
I love that. Another part about it is that, there's events that are shaping Kate's reaction, past events that are shaping Kate's reaction to current events, but also there's that theme of, am I my family? Mm-hmm. Can a person change? Mm-hmm. Is my parenting and my partnering and my adult womanness contingent on the way I was raised? Am I turning into my mother? All of that. Yeah. And I love how that's paired up with your background in neuropsychological research, because this, all that I've been reading about epigenetic research about how we can almost inherit the DNA of our parents, not just, that our DNA can change according to our health and our life events, and our children can inherit that changed DNA. So It's fascinating. So experience really does get in the body, get in the bloodstream.
It does. And, and nowadays, when you look at some of the research that they're doing on things like cognitive behavioral therapy, which shows that the way you think and the way that if you go through cognitive behavioral therapy, they see changes in brain chemistry. Yes. So you can change your brain chemistry by the way you think. So imagine if you are thinking improperly about something, or you're allowing, and I shouldn't say improperly because there's no improper thinking, but if you are processing something the wrong way, how that could become more solidified in your brain chemistry. If you think about the healing can change your brain, thinking about it the wrong way can change it the wrong direction. So I think neurochemistry is just a fascinating topic, and I'm not a neuropsychologist. Even though I worked in neuropsych research, I was a statistician and data person, and I did a lot of the management stuff for the company. So, but and also for me, the idea that it's not just our nature and nurture, it's not just our DNA and our experiences, but all of that is shaped by the people around us. The experience, So when you're in a marriage or a family and your behavior is influenced by the behavior of others, it's almost impossible to tease out. And that's why the title Blurred Fates is, are we destined in any way, or is it all just a big,
Yeah. Like each of us is in some kind of little ecosystem, and there's all kinds of movement all over the place. One more sciencey kind of thing I was thinking about metaphorically, this kind of begins with a contagious disease. It begins with the diagnosis. And I wondered if you wrote this well before the pandemic, but this book lands on readers at a time when we've all been thinking about contagion, and we've all been having opinions one way or another about someone's righteous or not righteous treatment of potentially contagious disease. So it sounds like it probably wasn't intentional because it came before the pandemic, but it sure lands in an interesting time.
I had not even thought about that, Shelley. That is such an interesting thought. But yeah, I mean, there is something about, there's an analogy in the book between a virus and a traumatic event. Like a trauma can be stored in your body like a virus. So it's there, and it's just waiting for a moment of weakness to burst out. And a lot of times you don't see it coming until it's already like there. And in that way, I think it is sort of similar to the COVID thing, in the sense that so many people are walking around with COVID before they know they have it. That's true for a lot of viruses. People don't know that they have it until they have an outbreak of some sort. And or they get the illness, it comes back to them. And so that to me is sort of an interesting, take on it.
Yeah, it's interesting factually, and it's definitely interesting metaphorically. It makes for really good reading. I was also thinking in another sort of angle, I was thinking about this book is in the category of domestic thrillers. And I don't think that category has existed that long. Or at least probably the category did, but the name for it, domestic thrillers, I think sort of rose up. I mean, for our listeners who are really mystery and thriller fans, it kind of rose up along with Gone Girl and the spate of novels that sort of put a woman at their center within the household, or personal interrelationships. Is that something that have you always been drawn to? I mean, I know you didn't intend to write a domestic thriller, but was this a space that was natural for you to enter? And if so, why? Or why did it just turn out that you wrote a thriller?
So it did kind of just turn out that I wrote a thriller, but I love thrillers. So it's not surprising to me. One of the things that my writing coach is always telling me is, you hear people say, oh, I just write by the seat of my pants, but they don't explain that they've read a gazillion of those kinds of books, or they've taken this many classes and they've been studying structure forever. So yes, it did just sort of come to me in that sense of, I'm a seat of the pants writer. I sat down, I knew I wanted to write something about this character, Kate, and I knew what the inciting incident was going to be, but I didn't really know how it was going to play out. And it changed over time. I mean, not only the plotting, but also the events themselves sort of, So I would say that for me, and I've lost my train of thought, so you might have to cut this out later. What was the original question?
About domestic thrillers.
Oh, a domestic thriller. I'm sorry. Yes. So I think that I didn't really know about the category of domestic thriller until the book was out in the world, with the ARCs were out, and people were coming back to me and saying, it's a thriller, it's a psychological thriller. Actually, it's a domestic thriller because it happens within the family structure. Mm-hmm. The main characters in the book are the husband, wife, the kids, her family of origin, his family of origin, and then their best friend who becomes like family. So it's really about this very small group of people navigating through life as a interconnected unit. And so they're all kind of influencing each other's behavior throughout. And that to me has always been the most interesting thing about life, is people and the way they interact. So it doesn't surprise me in a way that I wrote something about a psychological profile of a family.
Right. Separately from that, I'm just kind of wondering, you've mentioned a couple of things in there on your biography on your website about the organizations that you're part of. You're part of the San Diego Writers Festival. You head that up. Mm-hmm. And then also what's the name of the other one? Say it out loud.
So Say We All.
So Say We All. And I believe, is that the oral storytelling group?
It is. It's narrative nonfiction storytelling. Yeah.
So I want to ask you about that. But first I want to say, I have friends who say that they assert that most writers are introverts, that they have to spend so much time alone just to get the dang thing written, that they're, more likely to succeed at it if they really are introverts. And yet you find yourself out in the world organizing things with other people. And you described all the people that you've consulted with in the writing of your book and the altering of it. What is your take on the solo versus communal work of a writer?
So I am an introvert through and through. I have extrovert qualities in that I'm kind of outgoing and talkative, but social situations deplete my energy and I have to go and be by myself to restore it. And what I've learned through my therapy sessions was I had never thought of myself as an introvert until about 8-10 years ago, right when I was writing this book, actually. And my therapist said, no, it's really for her, the way she defined it. And obviously there's plenty of ways to define the difference between extrovert and introvert, but she defined it as when you're in a social situation, an extrovert takes energy from the room and an introvert is depleted by it. And when an extrovert leaves a party, they want more. It fills them up. Whereas an introvert is like, okay, I got to go home. I got to be by myself, or I got to go for a hike, or I got to do something by myself. So for me, the writing process has been great in that you are by yourself when you're writing. For the most part, it's you and your computer, or you and your piece of paper and pen, so that replenishes me. And it gives me the energy to do the community stuff, which replenishes me in a different way. But I often will leave a meeting and go for a walk, or leave a meeting and go for a hike by myself, because I do need that sort of space to fill back up. But I find that the community stuff has really made me such a more empathic person. It's made me I understand human nature better. And I've learned practical things and I'm actually the director of operations for the San Diego Writers Festival. I don't run it. It's just, I do a lot of the logistic stuff. The founders are Jennifer Thompson and Marnie Friedman, and they are the proponent, like the head of honchos. But that has taught me a lot about the business side of writing, which publicity, marketing, the relationship between authors and bookstores, between publicists and bookstores, between publicists and conferences and festivals, and how you get the word out about books. And so that has been really, really helpful. And the work that I do with So Say We All is also sort of a combination of the alone time and the group time, because So Say We All structure is that the program I'm involved in the most, there's something called VAMP, which stands for Video Audio Monologue Performance. And it's basically they have themes every month. You write to a theme. You submit your story through Submittable to a blind jury. They select 7 stories each month. You're assigned a writing coach and a performance coach. You work with them and the other writers that were selected for a 2-week period to rewrite and refine your story and practice performing it. And then at the end of the month, you perform it for an audience.
Oh my gosh.
Very compressed. It's very compressed and it's super supportive. One of the most supportive communities I've found. And so I got involved with writing stories for them. Then I became a writing coach and a performance coach. Then I joined the board. I've produced a couple of shows. And that experience has been superb from not only the writing standpoint, but from being in that role of coaching. Because when you have to work with somebody else and you find yourself saying things like, yeah, but if you cut that out, no one's going to know it was there except you, which has been one of the most freeing things for me as an editor. Is so many times I was holding on to something because it was like, this is so important, but the only one who thinks it's important is me. And the reader is going to read it and not ever know that it was there and is no longer there. So that was really helpful. But those kinds of things, it lets you, when you're on the opposite side of it as the coach, it lets you see it from a more objective, in a more objective way, which then allows me to bring that back to my own work. So I find that, being involved in these community projects, yes, I'm helping others, but I'm also helping myself. So.
Well, one of the things I noticed, on your website, I watched Putting the Fun Back in Funeral. Is that right? And it was just a wonderful performance of yours, in the So Say We All vamp tradition. And it was touching and a tribute to your dad who's passed, but also it was so funny and sweet. And because we've talked about this, that my mother just died, a couple of weeks ago. So I saw this video and I was really, really touched, really at the proof that my family's not whack for laughing at a funeral. So thank you for that. But
I know it's the title itself. I tell people like, oh, if you're going to watch one of the videos, you should watch Putting the Fun in Funeral. And they're always like, okay.
It was great. I advise that all of our listeners go to Anastasia's website and not only get her book, but also watch the video stories. I will also say something I was wondering about watching you perform that way. I'm involved in an organization called Stories on Stage Sacramento, and we have professional actors perform short stories of authors. And when we're getting those stories, we don't do it in this wonderful teaching way like you, but when we're getting those stories ready for the actors, there are changes you have to make. And it's so amazing to see what you can learn as a writer by those words coming out loud instead of just in print. If you're forced to say them out loud, it changes the story, and it's so clear the things that really ought to be cut. So a great practice for someone to go through.
It is. And, one of the questions that was asked of me last night at my lunch was, do I read my work aloud? And I read, as I'm writing, even if when I'm writing a novel, I read it out loud.
Yeah.
It often will help me to hear like things in dialogue that sound stilted, or where it's not clear who's talking, and it's clear that I need to add some more tags in there about who's saying what. It also helps with word repetition, because I was just telling somebody, I think that all of us writers have our pet words or pet phrases that we aren't even aware we're throwing in all the time. It's kind of the way I don't know, it's like a pattern or a habit that when you read it aloud, you often will catch those. You'll say, I think I just said that like 2 pages ago. And you go back and you're like, oh, I did. And so I think that, reading aloud, and also reading a short story aloud. One of the things I've learned, one of the first coaches I had said, it's a very different experience than reading something on the page. And you often need to make the words simpler. You're not writing for a reading audience. And so if a word trips you up, it's going to trip up the reader. And you can't have somebody thinking, what was that? Because they're going to miss the next 3 lines of the story. So you need to make it really clear. And so, yeah, it's been really helpful.
I have a friend, Amanda McTighe, who's an author, a fantastic writer, but she also has a history of a career in performance arts. She's been a professor of drama. So what she did for her last book was she hired a bunch of her drama students to do a table read of her book.
Oh, very cool.
Assigned roles. And it wasn't like a practice kind of thing. It was like read aloud. And she could catch the things that stop them or throw them. They have to read it over. And she's like, I thought that was perfectly clear, but it wasn't. These really smart people, these actors couldn't get that line out right because I wrote it wrong. So it's fascinating.
And also, like, you think that you're getting across with your, particularly with dialogue, the emotions that the person's feeling, but when someone else reads it and they read it in a way that's not, that it shows you didn't get that across through the words. So you either have to change the dialogue or you have to think about whether you need to add in how it was said, which of course, we've all been told, don't use, all of those said angrily, you should be able to get it from the dialogue, but sometimes that you can't. And so sometimes you do have to put in, how were they feeling when they said this? So
it's a judgment call.
Yeah, judgment call.
I'm going to ask you one more question. And that is that once our listeners and our viewers go out and get Blurred Fates and they read it and they love it and they're going to keep it and they're going to put it on their bookshelf, what are the other books that are going to sit on the bookshelf around Blurred Fates? What are the books that you think share a kind of DNA with Blurred Fates?
So I think that it could be in on one of two shelves. So the way I originally wrote the book, or the way I thought that I wrote the book, I would have it on a shelf with Wally Lamb and Elizabeth Berg and people who are telling stories about family, but a lot about psychological, like the inner workings of family. Once I realized that it was a thriller, I think could be on a shelf with Gone Girl, The Girl on the Train, The Golden Couple, that kind of sort of domestic or psychological thriller where you might have the unreliable narrator, you might have the twisty multiple perspectives where you think where something's going and then you hear from the other person and oh no, that's not exactly. So those are the two shelves that it could belong on either one, but it's probably tending more towards the latter.
I love it. Well, thank you so much. And I want to remind everybody this gorgeous cover belongs to Blurred Fates by Anastasia Zadeik. And Anastasia, where would you like your readers to find you if they're looking you up and looking at best places to get your book?
So you can find me on my website, which is my name, which is very hard to spell. So I will spell it for you. ANASTASIA and then ZADEIK.com. And I'm on Instagram and Facebook and Goodreads under Anastasia Zadeik. Mm-hmm. But I'm on Twitter, but I don't tweet. So if you go there, don't expect to see much.
You don't have to talk in every room you enter.
I can't. I just never, maybe someday, but I haven't figured it out yet. So.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate the time you're spending so soon after your launch. Congratulations. It sounds like it's going brilliantly and it's a fantastic book.
Thank you so much for having me, Shelley.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.